Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Just ask those of you, please be seated. And to those who are joining us on Zoom, good morning, good afternoon. My name is Amani Aljak, and on behalf of the Consortium on Gender, Security, and Human Rights, it is my pleasure to welcome you today. This talk is run as a hybrid event with live audiences here at UMass Boston, as well as participants from around the world joining us via Zoom. This is the final event of the Consortium Speaker Series for Fall 24, which has been organized in collaboration with the Department of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, with support from the Mellon Grant Affirming Multifocal Humanities. I would like to thank the Consortium Director, Dr. Carol Cohn, as well as the Consortium Program Admin, Claire Kendrick, and the Consortium interns who have put so much effort into organizing today's event and all the events for this fall series. I would also like to thank our co-sponsors for today's event. And we say here at UMass, it takes a village, and we have quite a group of sponsors: the Office of the Provost and Vice Chancellor of Academic Affairs, the McCormick Grad School of Policy and Global Studies, the Honors College, the Office of Global Programs, Student Multicultural Affairs. We would also like to thank the Departments of Latino Studies, Sociology, Political Science, Conflict Resolution, Human Security, and Global Governance and Asian Studies. Before I introduce our distinguished speaker today, I would like to say something about the location where this event is taking place. As many of you know, UMass Boston and its surrounding communities are based on unceded homeland of Massachusetts, Pawtucket, and many indigenous groups. The way land has been passed from non-indigenous group to where it is now has been through a violent history of genocide, forced removal, violent trauma, death, and disposition. All of them continue to happen as we speak today. We do understand that acknowledging and this acknowledgement by themselves are not enough. They are only one small step in supporting indigenous communities, and they need to be followed by action, by building solidarity, and by supporting the land back movement. So while people are kind of seated, we have a couple of people at the back. I would like to talk a little bit about the structure of Dr. Nisrin's talk today. We will be taking questions from both those here in the room as well as our Zoom audience. We already have 16 questions from some of the students who are attending from Dr. Chaudhry's class, Gender in the Global Context. For those in the room, if you have questions at the end of the talk, please also raise your hand and I'll be able to get your questions. For those who are joining us on Zoom, the Q&A section is open and will be open throughout the event. Just make sure that you post your questions, and if you could write your names, that would be great. The chat will be open at the beginning for the Zoom audiences. The chat will be open at the beginning, will stop during the talk, and will open afterwards. So feel free to introduce yourselves as well via Zoom. Like at the end of the talk, a short survey will pop up on Zoom. We'll be grateful if the Zoom audience will take the time to kind of fill the survey. These are very useful for us as we plan our next events. We also have some short survey on your chairs. For those of you who are in the rooms, please take the time to fill that form and hand it to us before you leave the room. I also want to kind of let people know that this event will be recorded and will be posted to the consortium website, as well as to our to the consortium website and YouTube channel. So that's kind of pretty much some of the kind of logistics for how we are running the event. I would like now to introduce our distinguished speaker. Dr. Nisrin Elamin is assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and African Studies program at University of Toronto. Her work investigates the connection between land, race, belonging, and empire making in Sudan and the broader Sahel area. She has a PhD in cultural anthropology from Stanford and a BA in socio-political development from Harvard. So you're a Bostonian here too, right? She's currently working on a book project based on ethnographic field research in Central Sudan, which examines the way landless and landholding communities are contesting and challenging the changes in land ownership promoted by Gulf Arab Corporation investments in Sudan previously and during this war as well. It situates the kind of question of land grabbing in agricultural kind of areas in Sudan, particularly the Jazeera scheme, which is kind of the main agricultural project in the country, within a layered history of enclosure and equal land relations shaped by legacies of enslavement and colonial rule. Dr. Elamin is a member of Sudan Solidarity Collective, which has been supporting local emergency responses through kind of the past 10 years, and particularly now during the current war in Sudan. Several publications, and I know that some of the students from Professor Chaudhry's class have read some of your work and submitted questions based on what they have read as well. But she has several publications, her new kind of coming book, and we are really eager to hear. This talk is dear to my heart since it's talk about what is happening in Sudan, which impact me and many of us who are here personally and impact our family. It's our great pleasure to have you, Nisrin.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction. I also would like to thank Claire Kendrick, Dr. Carol, Dr. Jack, Munira as well for inviting me to be here. I really appreciate it. So before I start, I just want to take a moment to honor and remember the many martyrs of Sudan's ongoing revolution and the countless people in Sudan, Palestine, the Congo, and right here on these occupied lands and elsewhere who have lost their lives due to militarized state violence over the last decades and centuries. Can everybody hear and see? Yes? Okay, great. So on April 15th, 2023, a brutal war erupted in Sudan, triggering the world's largest displacement crisis. The scant international media coverage of the ongoing war has largely failed to capture the socio-political dynamics and historical roots that frame it. An accurate framing is important in this moment. I've divided this talk into several sections: history, revolution, counter-revolution, and life. Instead of giving you a sort of comprehensive historical overview of the roots of the current war, I'm going to link a rather obscure historical anecdote to the outbreak of this first civil war in Sudan in 1955, to situate the current war within a long history of state violence, and to nuance the center-periphery framework that shapes it. And now I start with history, and you should know that I'm not a historian. I'm trained as an anthropologist, and what that means is that you shouldn't trust anything I say. So history. Sudan has had a long history of popular resistance against the state. And here I want you to look at the map. Sudan borders 7 countries, right? see. Sorry. The historiography of this resistance tends to center around urban revolutions, which overthrew military dictators. Sudan's December Revolution is often compared to its 1964 revolution, sparked by clashes between students, convening a symposium on the question of South Sudanese autonomy, and police at the University of Khartoum that toppled Ibrahim Aboud's military regime, or to the 1985 Intifada, triggered by US and IMF recommended austerity measures that overthrew Jafar Nimeri's military dictatorship. But today I'd like to trace the genealogy of this resistance back to the 1950s to demonstrate that the demands made of the Sudanese state and the challenges brought to its very legitimacy when it was first forming are still very relevant today. Britain's parting gift to Sudan at independence in 1956 was an economy dependent on the extraction of cash crops like cotton and a political system which was reconfigured to serve the interests of a northern and central Sudanese Nubian and Arab-identified elite. Both systems developed at the expense of the masses in the south and other marginalized regions, but also of a rural farming population at the center who helped sustain this extractive, export-oriented economy. As an example, the British vacated 800 administrative seats, civil servants, agricultural scheme managers, top army and police officials, etc., across the country on the eve of independence, of which Sudan's new ruling elite allocated 6 to South Sudan, an area the size of Texas, with a population of over 2.5 million. The remaining 790 plus seats were primarily occupied by riverine elites from the north and center. As such, this so-called Sudanization process facilitated and enshrined the ongoing systemic marginalization of other regions, such as Darfur, Eastern Sudan, Kordofan, and the Blue Nile region. Some of the initial forms of resistance against the new post-colonial state came unsurprisingly from tenant farmers who organized to demand, among other things, a greater share of profits as world cotton prices plummeted. A strike took place on a cotton scheme near Kosti shortly after independence. The state responded with extreme violence. Over 300 striking tenant farmers were shot on the fields or suffocated in overcrowded, poorly ventilated detention cells. A year earlier, Sudan's first civil war had broken out between Southern Sudanese demanding political representation, equitable resource distribution, and regional autonomy, and the central government, who had essentially subsumed the South as a quasi-internal colony. In August of 1955, and you can read more about this incident here, South Sudanese members of the British-administered Sudan Defense Forces, Equatorial Corps, mutinied in the southern town of Tourit. This mutiny was partly inspired by the Sudanization process led by northern elites, but also by their repressive response to a labor protest following the abrupt dismissal of 300 southern workers from a textile factory in the southern town of Nazara, during which 14 protesters were killed by the army. While the mutiny was brutally squashed, it laid the groundwork for Southerners to take up arms against the central government. And again, to learn more about this history and time period, you can read Skopas Pogo's work. This 1956 massacre on the Joda pumping scheme near Kosi is linked to the outbreak of the First Civil War because striking farmers in Sudan Center were threatening existing capitalist labor relations that allowed ruling elites to extract maximum profits to fund its repressive campaign against Southern resistance fighters. I highlight this historical moment because it reveals the way state violence in Sudan has long been shaped by the need to reproduce and maintain an extractive war economy that serves elite interests by any means necessary. We can draw a straight line from the outbreak of the Civil War in 1955, which over the decades and in its 2 phases killed over 2.5 million mostly South Sudanese people, to the current war that arrived in the capital, Khartoum, on April 15th, 2023. In the same way that we can draw a straight line between the Nakba of 1948 to the genocidal violence the Israeli state is currently unleashing in Gaza. History is not only context here, it is a necessary framework of analysis for understanding the roots of this violence in and beyond Sudan. And this framework forces us not to exceptionalize this violence, currently engulfing parts of the country in unprecedented ways, but to situate it within a longer history of violence that underpins the country's economic and political system of elite rule. Since the 1950s, and certainly under the Nimeri and al-Bashir regime, we saw this need to serve Sudanese elite interests by any means necessary manifest itself in the form of an ethno-nationalist, monocultural, right-wing religious project being imposed on a multiracial, multilingual, multi-religious country in violent ways. We saw this play itself out in Darfur, where a state-sanctioned campaign of genocidal violence led by the Janjaweed militia, now known as the Rapid Support Forces or RSF, was carried out beginning in 2003, killing hundreds of thousands, wiping out entire villages of non-Arab farming communities, and displacing millions of Sudanese civilians from resource-rich land which continues to be exploited to fuel the current war. It is this project and the violent, extractive, militarized state that imposed it that the most radical elements of the revolution set out to dismantle. All forms of dissent and organized resistance against this ideological project and state, repression more broadly, and there have been many, have been brutally suppressed through an ever-expanding security apparatus of law enforcement bodies, paramilitary forces, torture houses, prisons, and surveillance tactics. The violence of this project, however, cannot be solely pinned on Sudan's state and business elites. It required buy-in from ordinary people as well, who oiled the racist propaganda machine that legitimized and facilitated it. Thousands of people were absorbed into the security state as the regime's foot soldiers. Darfurians getting recruited as frontline soldiers to fight in the war against South Sudanese rebels through the Popular Defense Forces, one of the primary instruments of Islamist political and popular mobilization, and dispossessed farmers and herders in Central Sudan getting absorbed into the lower ranks of the infamous NIS, National Intelligence and Security Services, known for its raids and violent crackdowns on protests, dissidents, civil society activists, and journalists, are two examples of how ordinary Sudanese, many themselves neglected and marginalized by the state, became agents of its repressive counterinsurgency. In April of 2019, a popular revolution ousted Omar al-Bashir after 30 years in power, after converging in a massive sit-in in front of the military headquarters in Khartoum. And this revolution was years, if not decades, in the making. We saw rural and urban demands for land reform and economic justice at the center converge with decades-old struggles for justice and self-determination in Sudan's so-called peripheries. In December of 2018, protests emerged in towns like Atbara, a town known for its railroad worker organizing, Mairnu and Damazin, which are both agricultural towns further south, before converging into some fatally centralizing in front of the military headquarters in the capital. After al-Bashir's ouster, the sit-in remained in place for 3 months because people's demands exceeded calls for regime change and because military elites from within al-Bashir's inner circles had reclaimed power. The backbone of the revolution consists of neighborhood resistance committees, or RCs, of which there are close to 8,000 across the country, but also independent farmer and labor unions, professional associations, feminist, youth, and student formations, the kind of grassroots civil society that has mostly, but not entirely, resisted NGOization and formal opposition party politics. The resistance committees, and here's just a couple more images. The resistance committees are neighborhood consensus-based collectives that have been operating in the absence of a civilian-led state for the last decade. They developed in direct opposition to the popular committees established by the former regime, to which the state infiltrated and extended its reach to the neighborhood level. They have coordinating committees at various city, district, and state levels to which they elect representatives. Most emerged in 2013 during anti-government protests triggered by IMF-recommended austerity measures. Beyond coordinating these protests, they have also organized around restoring access to water and other basic services. Under the umbrella of mutual aid, or NAFIR, they served as an organizing vehicle for flood relief efforts, COVID prevention, playground cleanups, school and mosque repair projects, and mobilized against government land grabs. This mutual aid work served to draw ordinary people who were averse to or disillusioned by politics into their political organizing. Labor activist Rabab al-Naim points out that it is not useful to study neighborhood resistance committees as a unifying structure. A resistance committee is, after all, a reflection of the political and social class behind it. Their politics naturally differ across class, region, and location, and they've had to contend with internal contradictions and fragmentation, but most have adopted a politics that is critical of the violent, extractive, and ethno-nationalist character of the state. While they do not represent a unified structure, they are a powerful revolutionary political force and emerged clearly as such during the transitional period and after the October 2021 coup, when some of the resistance committees located in the peripheries began drafting revolutionary political charters, which you can find online in English as well. One of them, the Revolutionary Charter for Establishing People's Power, offers us a model of what popular democracy from the bottom up looks like. It proposes a decentralized governing structure that implies the dismantling of the militarized Sudanese state in its current formation. Organizer Abdel Salim Mindas describes it as a process of occupying the institutions of power from the bottom levels to the top by localizing, democratizing, and diffusing this power through local and state councils, executive and judicial structures. And it is this disorganization and inversion of centralized elite power and violence that is perhaps why the resistance committees and the Sudanese revolution more broadly captured people's imagination around the world. It is also why the current war in Sudan can be understood as part of the counter-revolution that metastasizes and emerges simultaneously as the revolution evolves and adapts to the dialectical pendulum swing towards populist fascism, which brings me to counter-revolution. In June of 2019, after an RSF-led and state-sanctioned massacre broke up the sit-in, we saw the resistance committees and the more radical elements of the revolution sidelined during the formation of a transitional government in favor of civilian elites, many from the diaspora, who attempted to open Sudan up after decades of isolation due to Clinton-era sanctions to international donor funding. Those civilian elites turned outward during the transition, adopting neoliberal reforms because their political power was restricted, because the power was always kind of tilted towards military elites, rather than remaining inwardly focused on the demands emerging from the streets. An example of this is something you might have heard about called the Abrams Accord, a normalization with Israel agreement, which was signed by Sudan during this transition, following Bahrain and Morocco, in exchange for being dropped from the US list of state sponsors of terrorism and the promise of over $1 billion in annual financing from the World Bank, amidst opposition from the public. After the October 2021 military coup, we saw UN peace talks led by the US, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the UK legitimize and prop up the coup leaders, Al-Burhan, the head of the army, and Hemeti, the head of the rapid support forces, which I'll talk more about later, both responsible for war crimes that span decades. These talks framed the two generals as potential reformists rather than heeding the call of the resistance committees, which called for no negotiations, no legitimacy, and no partnership with the military. And this lack of accountability and international diplomacy as a tool of empire, prioritizing stability over revolutionary demands, is partly what paved the way for this war. As civilian and military elites attempted to negotiate a new power-sharing agreement behind closed doors after the October 2021 coup, and this was the initial signing of the transitional government, the resistance committees and other formations continued to fill the void created by the largely absent service-providing wing of the state. They monitored the distribution of fuel to petrol stations to avoid price gauging and shortages. They delivered bread and cooking gas cylinders to houses in their neighborhood. In Al-Rahad, North Kordofan, resistance committees broke down government-run zakat stores, took out grain, and redistributed it. In other areas, they formed sliding-scale food markets. Workers across different sectors, including port workers, teachers, etc., organized some of the longest labor strikes in Sudan's history, demanding better wages and working conditions, and challenging the use of harmful chemicals in the agribusiness and mining sectors. When the current war erupted in the capital on April 15th of 2023, the military coup regime imploded and split, with each military faction vying not only for political, but also economic control of the country. The trigger for this war is often reduced to a disagreement and internal power struggle over security sector reform. But its root causes are far more structural and historical, as many others have argued. On one hand, we have the Rapid Support Forces, formerly known as the Janjaweed, led by General Hamidti and its allied militias, whose leaders control much of the livestock and illicit gold trade in the country. Sudan is Africa's third largest producer of gold, and the UAE, as its main gold trading partner, is now providing critical military support to the RSF as it extracts Sudanese gold. This gold gets smuggled out from Darfur through Chad and the Central African Republic to the gold markets of the UAE and sold to Russia and other countries. Were the United Arab Emirates to cut its funding lifeline to the RSF, the conditions on the ground would change significantly. On the other hand, we have the Sudanese armed forces and its allied Islamists, led by General Burhan, who's here on the right, who control large sectors of Sudan's economy, close to 200 companies in rubber, livestock, wheat, cement, real estate, gum arabic, pharmaceuticals, and construction, some of which are in turn backed by Gulf financing. Egypt provides critical support to the army, partly in an effort to protect its interests with regards to the Red Sea and Nile River Basin, particularly in relation to the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Evidence suggests that Ukraine, Iran, and Turkey have started supporting the army as well, presumably in an attempt to challenge the power and wealth Russia and the Emirates are accumulating through this war. In 2013, the Janjaweed were turned into the Rapid Support Forces by former dictator al-Bashir as part of a coup-proofing strategy against the army. They were also legitimized by something called the Khartoum Process in 2014, a process through which the European Union is attempting to externalize its border to the region between Sudan and Libya. And here you see a picture of East African migrants being rounded up by the RSF at the time and deported, right? At the time, it funneled 200 million to the RSF, to the former regime, to militarize this border in order to stem the migration of East Africans into Europe. The Rapid Support Forces and army have both sent troops to fight in Yemen on the Saudi coalition's behalf, thereby expanding their transnational networks. In my own research, I look at the $27 billion investments that Saudi and Emirati elites have made in Sudanese land and infrastructure over the last 20 years. And I document the many forms of popular resistance they have inspired. Before the war, the Saudis and Emiratis controlled more Sudanese land than all of Sudan's large domestic investors combined. In the early 2000s, the Bashir regime began implementing neoliberal policies to privatize the rural sector and to withdraw state extension services and inputs from farmers in order to attract foreign and domestic investments in land. This was partly to make up for losses in oil revenue, 75%, that would accompany South Sudan's likely independence in 2011. Everybody still with me? I know it's a lot of information. In the agricultural Jazeera region of Central Sudan, where I do my research, these investments were facilitated by a 2005 law which decimated the small-scale agricultural sector, forcing small farmers into debt to pave the way for both domestic and foreign large-scale land deals. And these land grabs, if you will, have restructured Sudan's agricultural economy and decimated the dairy industry in particular, and made rural communities much more dependent on food imports from other regions and countries, making people more vulnerable to food insecurity. Gulf-owned farms in Sudan grow water-intensive alfalfa and other kinds of animal feed that is exported to dairy farms in the Middle East, but also for meat production. These same dairy products have flooded rural markets and decimated local small-scale dairy production. It is among dispossessed pastoralists who used to produce milk that the Rapid Support Forces, who are now, along with the army, Sudan's biggest employers, have found some of their most willing recruits. Instead of looking at these Gulf investments purely through the lens of food security, we should understand them as part of a strategy to control circuits, networks, and nodes of distribution and production across the Horn of Africa. And that desire is evident in a 2022 $6 billion port deal that Emirati elites signed with Sudanese government and business elites. The deal was upended by the war, but it represents the UAE's attempt to undermine Sudan's national port, because it's about 200 kilometers north of Port Sudan, and to benefit from Sudan's strategic location along the Red Sea as it expands its power across the Horn of Africa through similar port deals. And here you can see some of the other port deals that the UAE has been engaged in. A process that is necessarily counter-revolutionary, requiring stable, authoritarian, elite rule. So here I've tried to lay out, right, here's a map of the sort of different countries involved in agricultural investments. What I've tried to lay out here is some of the fragments of a more complex political economy of Sudan's war, which compelled Sadr Abbas, Rabab al-Naim, Abdul Rauf Umar, and I to frame this war not as an internal power struggle or proxy war, as it is sometimes understood, but as a multi-scalar, counter-revolutionary war that is meant to serve and protect the interests of Sudanese elites and their international partners, and to preserve the Sudanese state. And I will add that while the proxy war framing is compelling, it tends to obscure the role Sudanese state and business elites have played for decades in laying the foundation upon which this war is being waged, and minimizes their role in leading it. Sudan's civilian population of 48 million is now caught in the middle of this senseless war, while its borders remain difficult to reach and cross. People have resorted to paying smugglers over $1,000 to cross into Egypt, for instance, often risking imprisonment and deportation in the process. 26.6 million Sudanese are now in dire need of food aid in a country that could easily feed itself and the entire region. Only 26% of the estimated 4 billion needed to launch an adequate response effort has been received by the international community, and both parties have obstructed the entry of international humanitarian aid. 19 million children are out of school, and the healthcare system has largely collapsed. Over 14 million people, that is 30% of the population, have been displaced by this war, making Sudan the largest internal displacement crisis in the world, and yet no country has issued expedited, free, special visas for Sudanese refugees. Many countries, including the governments of Tunisia, Egypt, and the United Kingdom, have begun deporting Sudanese citizens, in some cases through funding from the European Union, in the case of North African countries. The death toll is estimated to be somewhere around 150,000, but the exact number is difficult to track and document, particularly amidst frequent nationwide internet and phone service blackouts and attacks on journalists. Since the war began, the Rapid Support Forces have terrorized civilians by occupying and looting their homes, and they've used sexual violence as a weapon of war and civilians as human shields against the aerial attacks of the army. The UN estimates that 6.7 million people are at risk of gender-based violence perpetrated primarily by the Rapid Support Forces, but also by other armed actors. In Darfur and the Nuba Mountains, they have reactivated ethnic cleansing campaigns that long predate this war. In farming areas, they have destroyed key agricultural infrastructures and production sites, looted farms and grain storage facilities, and attacked farmers attempting to plant. Since October, they've been committing massacres in farming villages across the agricultural Jazeera region of central Sudan, causing a mass exodus from the region. They've looted tens of thousands of some of the oldest and archaeologically most important artifacts in the world, from Sudan's national museums and heritage sites, including some that date back to 2500 BC. The army, on the other hand, has failed to evacuate or protect people and has bombed civilian areas, including hospitals and homes, killing civilians in the process. It has also repeatedly denied that famine exists in parts of the country, despite ample evidence to the contrary. In August of 2024, the army bombed an IDP camp on the outskirts of El-Fasher in North Darfur, where 38% of children suffer from acute malnutrition in an attempt to, quote, eliminate the evidence for famine. Contrary to some analysis, and I know this is controversial, that frame the Rapid Support Forces as a non-state entity and militia gone rogue, the RSF and the Sudanese army are part of the same state apparatus that grabbed power in the 2021 coup, upending a process that was meant to lead Sudan towards democratic elections and civilian rule. In the midst of this brutal war, emergency response rooms have emerged across the country, some modeled after resistance committees and led by many of its members, rooted again in neighborhoods, right? They're taking in people that are fleeing their homes. In the face of a barely present international aid community, they are leading food and medicine distribution efforts, organizing communal kitchens, driving ambulances, coordinating evacuation and protection activities, setting up ad hoc emergency clinics, rape crisis centers, and women response rooms, converting defunct schools into shelters, repairing and restoring public services such as water and electricity, retrieving and burying dead bodies, liaising with store owners and pharmacists to source food and medicines, and running urban gardening projects. In Khartoum alone, there were, and this has changed lately, 69 of these emergency response rooms across 7 districts, coordinated by over 1,400 volunteers. In Darfur, there were over 89 of them coordinated across 5 states. Many have had to shut down over the last few months due to lack of funding, violence, and targeted attacks on volunteers. Though very much intergenerational, many are led by young people whose education was interrupted by this war, some of whom have chosen to stay in war zones while their relatives have evacuated to safer countries or safer towns or countries. So I'm going to do something that probably doesn't happen very often in academic lectures, but I'm going to ask you to go to sudansolidarity.com, or at least to write it down, make a mental note. I want to ask you to please consider becoming a $5, $10, $25 monthly donor if you can. We've raised about $500,000 this year for these emergency response rooms, and many of the collective members are students like yourselves, mostly from small donors, from $10 donors. No amount is too small. Okay. Your monthly support allows them to sustain this life-saving work and to remain independent as well. The Sudanese diaspora and their non-Sudanese allies, meaning you, play a critical role in helping the emergency response rooms and other mutual aid networks preserve their independence by providing sustained material support with no strings attached. Despite generally being viewed as a non-political form of volunteerism, these emergency response rooms represent to some a historically situated attempt to continue the project of dismantling the state in its current formation. Resistance Committee member Mohammed Abeid argues in an interview with the New Humanitarian that the emergency response rooms should not only be seen as humanitarian groups, but as introducing a new form of decentralized service delivery that could replace the state itself. He says, quote, "I see this as a normal development of the Sudanese youth groups, which are initiating self-governance in their neighborhoods, replacing the dominant state with grassroots councils based on people's demands, not the war leaders' demands." But emergency response has also forced a shift in the temporality of revolution, as activist Muzan Anil has argued, reorienting organizers towards putting out fires and away from the deliberately slow-moving process and politics of imagining and building towards freedom. In other words, they are losing the battle of time as their energies are absorbed in coordinating and leading life-saving humanitarian relief efforts, usually carried by large international NGOs rather than in the political organizing that sustained the revolution. And replacing the state, especially through service provision, is of course not in and of itself a radical transformative project. NGOs have filled the service provision gap for decades, often through processes that de-radicalize or co-opt social movements directly challenging the state. And so I'm just going to end by saying this. I think one of the things that these emergency response rooms are doing, right, is that they're currently running mutual aid efforts, including but not limited to these rooms, across the country by meeting the day-to-day needs of hundreds of thousands in the midst of this brutal war, despite massive inflation and food shortages. They are insisting on staying put, on living, and on sustaining each other to live amidst the threat of death, sexual violence, and torture. While the needs are far greater than they can fulfill, it is thanks to them that many of our loved ones are surviving this war. I've not heard the volunteers we've been in touch with articulate kind of politics of replacing the state per se, but their labor constitutes a form of revolt that we have yet to discern and name, and that at the very least deserves recognition as a form of resistance against the militarized state and the many forms of violence it produces. So I'm just going to end with a few lines here that I wrote. Is that okay? Yep. In the beginning of the war, inspired by my father, who participated in the student protests that preceded independence, and then 62 years later in the December Revolution, and insisted that we let him die in his ancestral village because he refused to become a refugee as he neared the age of 90. Life is my 87-year-old father, a few days into this war, watching Khartoum burn from his window in our rented apartment, breaking out into song, a love song to the beloved city of his youth. It is two youth from our neighborhood resistance committee risking their lives to bring my stubborn uncle, who refused to leave home, a bucket of water from the Nile every evening to keep him alive. It is this refusal to leave home. Life is my sister friend in Niala, South Darfur, coordinating a food drive for 30 families amidst an attack on her city, days after finding out she's going to be a mother, inshallah, in a safer place and time. Life is my cousin's 5-year-old daughter during the first weeks of this war, tearing pieces of bread and hiding them in a plastic bag under her pillow for my 3-year-old for the day when maybe there is none left. Life is my aunt insisting on ritual as we left her home in late April to make sure that we return safely to our beloved home at peace, inshallah. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Nasreen. Really appreciate your talk here. So we have like 16 questions from the students in the class. We'll try, given the time, for students who are in this class, which have like about less than 10 minutes, Ilona. Right. So we'll prioritize the students' question first, and then we'll take a second round. So I will start with the questions around power relations and identity. The first one is, how do women resistance differ by age? What roles are younger women playing in protest and in the resistance? The second question relevant to that is, what role do you see for young women in shaping Sudan political future at this time? There is a question about class. Could you talk about class differences and how that impact protest, revolution, and resistance in Sudan? There is a question about motherhood. How do you see women in their roles as both biological and symbolic mothers of Sudan revolution? How does that challenge traditional gender norms and reshape narratives of political agency in the struggle for social change and political change? So these are kind of the broader question about that. Do you want to answer, or do you want me to move to another? Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so these are great questions. I will say I'm not an expert on gender per se. I think both you should read Dr. Nada Ali's work, and I'm sure also Dr. Jack's work for that. But I will say, and I focus mostly on rural resistance. And I would say both urban and rural resistance, especially during the revolution, women were at the forefront. They always have been. There's a strong feminist movement in Sudan. And I think about 70% of the protesters on the streets during the revolution were women, right? And we see that now, the people that we are in contact with on a regular basis, the emergency response rooms across the country from Darfur to Khartoum, right? Many of them are coordinated and led by young women. And again, this is not exceptional in any way. This is sort of part of Sudan's history, I would say. But I think what we see time and time again, and I'm sure you've seen this across the semester, is that while women might be at the forefront of sort of grassroots popular resistance, right? When it comes time to form, say, a transitional government or to put people at the negotiation table, they're often sidelined, right? Or only given sort of token power, if you will. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind is, for me, I think the future of Sudan really lies in the hands of the people who are currently providing this kind of life-affirming labor, right? And if you look at the Revolutionary Charter, it kind of really thinks in a very inspiring way about inverting the power structure in a way that would also very much, put women at the forefront of this kind of political organizing and leadership, right? That's at least my hope. And I think we've seen that in the kind of organizing and mobilizing even during this war as well. As for class, I mean, one of the things, I think there's obviously an intersection here. One of the things that we saw during the transition was that the revolutionary charges that came from the more peripheral regions of Sudan, right, were actually more radical than the ones that came from, say, Khartoum. And of course, this has to do with people's own relationship to the state, and class as well. And so I think that's, people's positionality does influence how they envision transforming a country and ultimately the way that a state is structured, right? So I think, yeah.
So also there is a question about internal struggles among Sudanese activists and how do they resolve that? There is a question also, a couple of questions about the significance of Sudanese women in the revolution in terms of social change and agency, and can transnational feminist organizing help women activists and Sudanese society resist the violence and end this kind of long kind of term violence and harassment and gender-based violence that women face. There is a question about poetry and few questions, maybe we can forward them to you regarding the piece that you wrote about Ala Salah and emphasis on how the media particularly zoomed on Ala and didn't talk much about women who were kind of protesting alongside her or women from different parts of the Sudan. Then what are the barriers to feminist activism and their role in enhancing, like, not this revolution, but future revolution? There is a last question about what is the impact of this revolution on other parts of the globe, particularly in the region? Do you see any impact?
Yeah, these are all great questions. Again, I hope I'll remember. I'll start with the last one. I think when the revolution in Sudan started, I felt at least that the entire region was watching, right? There were solidarity acts between Algeria and Sudan, between Lebanon and Sudan. Of course, we know that the African continent, I think, has had about 90 popular uprisings over the last decade or so in 40 different countries. And so when we talk about the Arab Spring, we also have to acknowledge the African summer, if you will, right? And so I think there are lots of parallels across the continent. My husband is from Burkina Faso, for example. There was a revolution there, and we, as that was happening, we're seeing a lot of parallels. Sorry, a bit of a cough. And I think part of what inspired that kind of looking and collaboration even, right, and inspiration is the sort of very grassroots constituency or base of the revolution in Sudan, and how people kind of moved quickly beyond protests to organize themselves, right, through these resistance committees, through professional associations, through these feminist and youth kind of groups. And then on the flip side, and this is sort of where the counter-revolution comes in, you also had many attempts to co-opt sort of more grassroots organizing, right? And we saw that during the formation of the transitional government. We also saw that in the present, right, where you have, for example, groups in the United States who are trying to identify leaders of organizations like the emergency response rooms or the resistance committees that are purposefully horizontal, right? That are purposefully avoiding kind of charismatic leadership structures, right? And then external forces will often impose that on them and ask for, say, one leader to represent a very diverse constituency, which I think is, and I say this as somebody in the diaspora who's seen this process over and over again, where instead of maybe rethinking, I'm talking here about the peace negotiation processes that have happened during this war, right? Instead of rethinking the entire structure of peace processes and how, just how exclusive it has been, how peace has never really been central to these processes, but rather serves as a currency for people to gain certain types of power, right? And to kind of legitimize continued violence. Instead of rethinking that, a small seat is given to, say, a representative who ends up not really representing, the constituency that they're meant to be speaking for, right? So I think that is one. I'm trying to remember what other questions you asked. I don't know if we should open it up.
Okay. Yeah, so far we don't have questions from the Zoom. So if you have any question from the Zoom audience, can you please just put it in the Q&A section and we'll be Any of the students whose question were not asked, just put your hands up and you get nothing to pass you.
Don't be shy.
Question or Dr. Amin? Any comment?
Thank you. I really enjoyed your lecture. It was quite informative. How to like gratify ask my questions just illustrate that it is really amazing the work the people so that like collective action that is I believe it's especially it's kind of something that raises this question of like those investors like collective action. I am so like ecstatic just learning about this. It's why like now my question is a little related to this. I asked it actually when I took Dr. Nadali's class, like relating to how oftentimes like great events like some like changes and in history especially, they're also seen as like the works of great men. So history being essentially events made by great men, battles between great men, and like just how do you, I guess, feel about how clearly the revolutionaries in Sudan sharply like move away and like break away from just history of history and what does it do you think it really reveals from I guess I'm just interested in like hearing your perspective on that because I think it's endlessly fascinating just how it just reveals the truth about that like history isn't merely just the story of great men doing great things, but really collect, including women especially. In the case of Sudan, I think it's particularly important highlighting the fact that women are active participants and not merely damsels in distress that are constantly oppressed, as is often, I'd say, the view that's often ascribed to Muslim women across Muslim countries.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, for one, I appreciate your first comment, right? That I think I would love for people to, as devastating as the situation is in Sudan, I don't want people to leave this room feeling despair, right? Because part of what we're seeing is an incredible sort of heroism, if you will, or and really it's collective work, right? That is being done by many people, including but not exclusively only these emergency response rooms. We're also supporting a mutual aid group in the Nuba Mountains, for example, that isn't organized along these lines. And I think, yeah, what we're seeing is that people are perfectly capable of running a country without a violent, extractive, militarized state. In fact, it would be much better, right? If they were just to kind of leave, leave everybody alone and let them do what they're doing. Not that people should have to, but yeah, so that's, I think, one thing I want people to come away from is that we do have hope, right? Because of the way that people are mobilizing in the middle of sort of unimaginable violence, they're still managing to keep a lot of people alive, right? With very few resources. I also don't want to romanticize that work, but I think I just want to mention that. I think the second part about history, right? When I first came to the States, I taught actually in a school not far away here in Boston. I didn't know anything about US history. And so I assigned Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States as the main kind of textbook. And I do hope, and I think some people have written kind of people's histories of Sudan, but I hope that, 10, 20 years ago, 10, 20 years from now, when my daughter is your age, that she'll be able to sort of look back and read about a more people's history of Sudan, which centers the revolution, which centers the emergency response rooms, the resistance committees, right? The many kind of labor unions that have done incredible work, you know, and so I think that is always important. And people's histories always center women because women are at the forefront of collective organizing, always, right? You know, the same goes for the civil rights movement in this country, right? Without women, you wouldn't have had sort of powerful, the powerful organizing that was kind of the basis of the civil rights movement. If you think about people like Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, et cetera, and the many women who might remain unnamed. So I think, yeah, for me, it's important to kind of center not great men, as you say, but collective efforts, right? That without people working together wouldn't be so great because everybody kind of brings their own strength, their own interests, et cetera.
How do we in Sudan navigate both societal and political barriers? And what do you think is the biggest challenge? Challenges and opportunities for Sudan moving after
That's a good question. I did not grow up in Sudan, so it's a harder one for me to answer, but I will say, I mean, certainly during the last 30 years, the al-Bashir regime was incredibly repressive, right, towards women. There were laws that restricted people's movements and dress, and mostly targeting activists, but also working class women who were, say, selling, and I think you read about this in the article, but selling things like, say, brewed beer, right, to make a living, were then targeted through these laws. And I think, of course, at the intersection of class, race, and gender, the history of Sudan has shown us that there's a lot of work to be done for there to be accountability, right? For there to be justice, and that needs to be central to whatever comes after this war, if we're going to move out of these kind of cycles of violence that, of course, disproportionately affect women and girls. I think the other thing I will say is that, you know, post this war, in my view, the revolution continues, right? I don't think it really ever ended. I mean, they tried to end it through this war, but to me, the emergency response rooms, even though you know, they are explicitly non-political, are in many ways continuing the work that was started during the revolution. And so for me, once the guns are laid down, I think one of the biggest challenges will be accountability and justice for the many survivors of gender-based violence, right? But also, how do we center kind of more traditional, but also new forms of transformative justice in the process of rebuilding a society post-war? I think there are examples from other places across the continent, but of course, all of that needs to be homegrown, and Sudanese women in particular need to be at the forefront of kind of shaping what that will look like. So I think that's probably what I would say to that. Yeah.
So there's only more and I'm going to see that you have some many pieces. There is a specific question about your impact on that.
Poetry. You know, I'm actually writing a piece right now about the music and poetry of the revolution. So I will, it's a collaboration between somebody who's currently in Uganda. So once that comes out, I will be sure to send it to you. I mean, I think there's a very long tradition of music, poetry. There's a very good piece that Yasmin Abdelmajid just wrote about hip hop during the revolution and also during this war that you should check out. I don't know if I have anything specific to recommend. I think you should just search. You will find a lot of examples. I did have, let me see, I'm going to try to share this again. Yeah, here are just some pieces. I think anything by Muzan and Neil is always worth reading. I collaborated with a couple of people to write a piece for Hammer and Hope. There's a second piece coming out. And for that particular piece, it's not about poetry, but we wanted to really center the voices of non-elite people who are in the region, right? Most of them are either still in Sudan or in Uganda, who have been organizing, who've been activists for decades, if not, like in some cases, since the 1960s. We interviewed 4 people, including a person from South Sudan, about their activism, their relationship to the revolution, and their kind of views on the current war. So again, the second piece of that will be coming out soon. We also co-edited an issue of MERIP that Dr. Nada Ali is in as well on Sudan that you can check out. MERIP stands for the Middle East Research and Information Project. Here are some people that you can follow on X. I also recommend Khulud Khair for policy analysis, and then Radio Rabanga and Sudan Tribune are 2 places where you can get news. As you know, the news has been dismal on Sudan, especially in North America, I would say. And so it's important, I think, to kind of keep informed. Here, this is just a song that I usually show my students, but I'm sure you're aware of it, called Matalib. And you can listen to it on your own time. But it became somewhat of an anthem, at least for diaspora people, about the revolution. And it's in Arabic and in English. If you go to colors, you can find the song. Any other questions? Yes, please.
You spoke about the law of 2005 that led to the decimation of the agricultural sector or of the more traditional agricultural sector. That happened. What did the law say? How did they enable the land grabbing that then intensified? And then my other question is, you spoke about the through line from colonial extraction to a war extractive economy to this day, which of course goes along with all of that land grabbing. And I'm wondering what kind of thoughts you have, or what kinds of thoughts you're hearing from people in Sudan about the transformation of that, what a transformation of that would look like.
Yes. Thank you for those questions. So the first question, the 2005 law. Now, the 2005 law was specific to the Jazeera region, which was until recently home to the largest, or one of the largest, centrally managed irrigation schemes in the world, established by the British, right, in the 1920s to extract cotton, right? There was an ailing kind of British textile industry that essentially the Jazeera scheme tried to save. And so the 2005 law was meant to essentially dismantle the scheme. And the way that they did that is by selling off all of its productive assets. So that included, the tractors, the machines that kind of clean the canals, right? Because of course it's a very elaborate kind of irrigation system that brought the waters of the Nile to the different farms, right? Small farmer kind of plots, if you will. They sold off, everything from buildings, machines, what else? All the productive assets that you would need to run an agricultural scheme to the highest bidder. Many of them were domestic elites, but there were also some with foreign financing. And essentially what it did is it forced many farmers into debt because they were all of a sudden left to their own devices, right? People weren't able to kind of clean their canals anymore. They didn't have the equipment, right? They also kind of laid off most of the scheme's sort of agricultural engineers and experts, right? And so people were left to their own devices. Some of them started kind of cooperative arrangements But for the most part, people didn't have the resources to continue, say, cleaning the canals, and their input, their yields kind of crashed, if you will. In addition, the state also withdrew all of its state extension services. So inputs like fertilizers, seeds, et cetera, that were previously provided were no longer provided. And the idea was to force people to sell their plots, right, to the government at way below market price. People, of course, got organized. There's a Jazeera and Managid scheme, Farmers Alliance, that essentially tried to help farmers retain their land by giving them some of these supports that the state had withdrawn. And they succeeded for the most part. And they also won a legal a legal victory in the courts that essentially stopped the government from sort of preying on indebted farmers and sort of, and made it illegal for them to purchase land at below market prices from them. So for the most part, people managed to retain access or retain their land, if you will. But of course, that process also mirrored other privatization policies across the country, and in particular, across on the other side of the Blue Nile, where I do most of my research outside of the scheme, that process of privatization was accelerated because unlike on the scheme where people's land is officially registered, in other parts of Sudan, that registration process differs. And so a lot of communal lands were essentially taken over by the state, were stolen from people, right? And so that goes to the second question, which is that part of what the Farmers Alliance, but also landless workers have been advocating for is a complete transformation of the legal system that we inherited from the British that is essentially meant to facilitate state land grabs, if you will, right? If you look at the land laws that were established in the 1920s by the British, they're meant to allow the state to take communal lands that have been used for generations by herders, by farmers, right? If it is considered unproductive. Now, who gets to decide what unproductive is, right? Is land that herders are traveling through, right, to graze their animals unproductive? Is land that is used for rain-fed farming unproductive? The state would say yes, right? But of course, we know that's not true. And so this is one of the ways those land laws that were established by the British were verbatim sort of adopted in the post-independence era, right, by Nimeri and others. And then, of course, there were investment laws that kind of further expanded the power of the state to take over these lands. And I think, yeah, that's a very, very important factor. I think during the transition, land was not centered enough, right? Land reform was not centered enough. In fact, the Farmers Alliance met with the transitional government, with Hamdok, who was the civilian prime minister at the time, several times to discuss a reversal of the 2005 law. They had very concrete recommendations for how to do that, for how to rectify the damage that had been caused over the last 20 years. But people weren't listening to them, right? Because this model of sort of agribusiness investment continued to be pushed by those in power. And I think that to me is one of the main things that I would recommend from my own research, is that small farmers have a very good idea of what is needed, small farmers and herders, of what is needed to change the agricultural sector, what land reform should look like. They are really the experts, but they're often not consulted, or even when they are, they're ignored, right? And I think that's something that moving forward needs to happen. Sorry about my cough. I see some Sudanese people, I think, in the audience. No pressure, but.
First of all, thank you so much, Nisrin. Thank you for coming to us both, and thank you for your inspiring and insightful lecture. As usual, so my question was really about ways to involve our students in some of the activities that we're organizing in Toronto, but also beyond that location. I know in Europe as well. We have a newly formed Sudanese Students Association. Many of them are actually attending lectures and classes today. That's why they make it, that they will watch the recorded lecture.
Okay.
You know, so I just wanted to really thank you so much and to maybe expand a little more on ways in which students could be involved in such work.
Yes, thank you for that. Well, I mean, I think one of the things that I encourage everybody to do is to get organized, right? To form your own collective, join an existing collective, right? I think at this moment, we can't work on our own. And I think that became very clear for us at the University of Toronto. I have been traveling for the last semester, even though I'm supposed to be working on my book, but I've been traveling, doing this fundraising, but at the same time, there's a big collective and other people are also involved in speaking and coalition building with other groups. And so there are a couple of things I would say. One, if you are part of the Sudanese Student Union here, you can organize fundraisers, right? The collective is not the only group that is raising money for mutual aid networks. There's also a group called Sanduq Sudan, which is, you might know the singer Al-Sarra. She leads that group and she's based in New York. And they basically fund the same groups that we do. There's probably plenty of others. I mean, I know there are others, but I'll just name that. Of course, you can also donate to us. We recently had a fundraiser that Madaniya New York City organized. And I think they raised about 57,000 for us by just basically organizing a party, an auction. And that money will go very, very far at the moment because there's no overhead, right? We just send the money. There's maybe some it's like a bank transfer fees, but that's it. Everybody's a volunteer in this scenario. And we are fiscally sponsored by the Darfur Diaspora Association. These two very wonderful uncles, as I call them, who are kind of supporting this work, right? Who have been doing this work since 2006. So that's the first thing I would say is there are ways that you can fundraise and then funnel the money through the existing networks because it is quite complicated to get money over there and we've figured it out. It takes a lot of labor. But the other, I think, is, I don't know how many of you were involved in the encampments and other kinds of organizing on campus, but I do think that it's important to start coalition building with other groups, right? Because there are linkages between the struggles, the various struggles, whether it's, we, for example, have started working with Friends of the Congo and with the Palestinian Youth Movement on various campaigns around immigration policy. We're actually thinking about possibly launching a boycott divestment campaign with Friends of the Congo, right? Because a lot of the Emirati companies are also wreaking havoc in the Congo. Of course, it's complicated because in the case of the Congo, pretty much every company that you might use, whether it's your computer, Apple, whatever, is implicated, and so it's a bit of a different strategy, but it's something that we're starting to talk about. So I think that's and also you're welcome to join the collective. We have members in Montreal, in Vancouver, in London, in Egypt. You know, we've become sort of transnational. We're all women so far. Actually, there's one person, one guy, a poor guy, but you know, we welcome anybody. And we're sort of our politics are, as I said, we don't align with either the army or the RSF. We stand very firmly against any form of oppression, including homophobia, transphobia. But you know, and we welcome everybody. So non-Sudanese as well. So you're welcome to join us. You can talk to me or send us an email at sudansolidarity.collective@gmail.com.
Okay. Thank you so much, Nisrin, for your talk and your patience with all of our questions here. Just a reminder that we have our surveys. Please, if you could just take a time to fill the survey before you leave. We also have the survey online for the Zoom audience. Just please take the time. It's a short survey that would be useful. If you have any kind of more questions, you can pass them to us and we'll be able to forward them to Nisrin. I know that we'll be forwarding some of the questions from the class. To be engaged, particularly for our students here, any kind of, just keep the Sudan topic alive by raising awareness as well, and just advocacy to ensure that people know about what is happening in Sudan, and that would help a great deal given the invisibility or the lack of American and Western media coverage of what is happening in Sudan. But again, on behalf of Carol and Claire and the interns and the consortium, we're really grateful for you and for your coming all the way here. And we appreciate your work and you. Thank you so much.
You.